let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is I want to illustrate to you how normals affect your extrusions. A couple of things to point out here is that a cube has 6 sides, and each side is effectively generating its own normal direction. So if I grab a face here, you can see that there's not a lot of information. It's just a face, right? But I can see where the normal's pointing, because the normal could be facing inward or outward. I can see which way the normal's pointing by turning on our mesh edit mode overlays and switching on the normals toggle. There's a few different kinds. You can turn them all on if you want to. The only one I really use is the center face hairs here. We can actually make that a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. You can see they're all pointing outward, right? No matter which direction you look. Now, if I were to take this entire cube and extrude it all at one time, you immediately see that something's changed. The mesh that's left behind no longer shows its normals. Well, that's because they're facing inward. All the normals are facing to the inside now. So this happens. It's a fluke of Blender, I think. I'm not sure if it's intended behavior. Maybe they haven't accounted for it yet. But if you extrude an entire mesh, it just effectively duplicates the mesh and inverts the normals on those faces. So I'm going to go ahead. This is the original mesh. So if you end up doing this to yourself, where you've extruded the entire mesh, just delete that mesh, extrude it again, delete the mesh again, and you'll have your original. Or you can just use the F3 flip method too. So you can always go to F3 and just type flip, and there you go. So now you have your normals back to normal. Oh God, that's regular normals. Anyway, so we'll go to Control 2 for edge selection. I'm going to select this edge, and I want you to see what happens. I'm going to go to solid view here and put on a matte cap before I do that. I like these earth tone matte caps. There we go. I'm going to bevel this edge, and you can see as soon as I bevel it, it generates a new normal. Well, what if I were to increase the number of loops or the number of steps? Every single step gets a new normal vector, right? So that's very handy, because now we know that if we extruded every one of these, we'd create kind of a mohawk fan. So another way of extruding is Control F and then extrude individual faces. So you could probably imagine some geometry you could make with that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. I'm going to go ahead and bring back our original cube. And I just want you to see real quick how we can use the extrude individual faces to make interesting geometry. So if I extrude individual faces on a cube, I get this kind of like jack type shape. And if we rotate it Rx 45, Ry, let's say 25, now I have a hedgehog. Just a hedgehog. Maybe I could rotate it a little bit more. There we go. Yep. Like a storming the beaches of Normandy kind of thing. We'll go ahead and bring it over on the X, get it out of the way, but you can see it's a nice little hedgehog. You've probably seen this in like Call of Duty World at War or any of those war simulation games. Something like this. This would be a low poly version, of course, but you could see how really quickly you can get some really interesting geometry. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you what you can do with extrude individual faces to make, well, actually, let me show you one thing first. I want to show you how insets work. Now, I realize that that might be an entirely different lesson. Insetting is kind of a monster unto itself, but the combination of extrusion and inset is very powerful. So there's two things that I want to show you. The reason that I created a cylinder is just to save steps. If I would have done it from a circle and gone into the circle, filled it, inset it, and then selected this outer loop, and I know this is the instinct that many have. If I extrude this, this is the nature of extruding a plane though. The geometry underneath didn't actually fill in, not the way you would expect, right? So if I created a circle again and filled it, extruded the entire thing, the bottom's filled this time. Now, if I wanted to, I could always inset from up here, bring it straight down, go into wireframe mode, bring it straight down, and get my thickness that way. Alternatively, another way of doing this is using the solidify modifier. Now, I'm not going to show you every way to accomplish the same thing, not in this lesson. The scope of this lesson is more to just get you oriented to extrusions and the power of them. But I'm going to show you one more thing really quickly involving bridging edge loops. Because bridging edge loops is a form of extrusion, believe it or not. Whenever you add some loop cuts to a face, you can get it kind of like almost square. And I'm going to turn off these hairs, or just turn them down maybe a bit. That's cool. Okay, so now if I select along the x-axis a somewhat square group of faces, and then I can extrude out. Now that's kind of big. Maybe I don't want that much. So now if I inset, you might have to be careful. If you look up here along this top bar, it gives you some information about the current operations that are occurring. You see how it says boundary on individual eye off? So if I accidentally hit I twice, then I'm insetting individual faces. I don't want that right now. I want to inset as a group. And then let's also shrink it a little bit on the Y, make it a little bit more natural looking. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude outward. Okay, now if I hit S to scale, hit X, and then 0, it will flatten those faces. If you look really closely, it's still retaining some of the curvature from the cylinder. So SX0 will flatten those out. Then I can limited dissolve those faces. I can actually just delete those faces. And then if I come over, select this loop, and select this loop, if I Control E, and for the record, I don't know if you know this, but if you want to use the vertex, edge, or face menus, Control V for vertex, Control E for edge, and Control F for faces. So these menus are accessible right away from just using the Control key. Okay, so in this case, Control E for edges, bridge edge loops. And down here we have our little context menu with our options. So if I increase the number of cuts, we do end up with a weird kind of effect. Now this doesn't always happen, but typically it does happen for some reason when you have edges instead of faces. Now if I was using faces, they would know immediately which way to go, but then I would have faces inside of my geometry, and I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this loop, and then I'm going to go RY, and then -25, I believe. And then I will go down here, RY 25. So they're opposing. Now that they're kind of angled towards each other, if I do the same thing, bridge edge loops, increase the number of cuts, now I get a more controlled appearance. And if I want to really smooth things out, I can come over here and select this edge loop and just rotate it just a little bit. So I can go like this. And yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay, so now if I want to create thickness inside of here, there are a couple of ways I could do it. I could use the solidify modifier again, which is a little tricky, but you can constrain it with the vertex group, or I can just inset this and then come to a profile, go to wireframe, extrude, and I'll extrude to roughly the thickness of my walls. Cool. So now I'm going to introduce you to subdivision modeling just a little bit. So I'll go ahead and shade everything smooth really quickly. And then I'm going to Control 1, 2. I think 2 is probably good. Makes everything nice and smooth. But our bottoms, our rim, inside and outside bottom are not quite the right shape for a coffee mug. Let's go ahead and create a loop cut. I'm going to bring it all the way down. And then I'll select this inside face, inset just a bit. That looks pretty good there. And then what I'll do outside is grab another loop, bring this down, select this bottom face. I'm just switching between Control 2 and Control 3, face and edge selection. And then I'm going to inset right here. This might be too close. You get warned about this whenever you're doing, anytime you're doing game design or asset creation. If your edges are too tight, then it just looks too sharp, too unrealistic. I'm going to go ahead and add a loop cut, and I'm going to bring this inside up. And I'm going to do the same thing on the outside right here. Now, I think that looks pretty good. That looks like a mug that you would buy out of a coffee shop, and you can customize it a bit. But you could see with some simple extrusions, a little bit of bridging edge loops, insetting, a couple of loop cuts, you've got a really nice design. So you can expand on that, cut into it using a Boolean. I've showed you guys how to use Booleans already. I haven't showed you quite how to wrap meshes yet. We'll get to that. It's a little bit more advanced. So the next thing I want to show you, I was going to go back to that icosphere. So you have the icosphere here, and I'm going to bring it up just a little bit. So we have the faces. They're all triangles. It's really nice. That's why I prefer using the icosphere over the UV sphere, which has irregularly sized faces. Now this follows a more geospatial coordinates type of face mapping, while this follows a more geodesic type of shape. So it's up to you how you want to proceed, but I prefer starting with the icosphere, and then you can always subdivide it if you wanted to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to inset just a little bit. Now you'll notice that it's not actually doing anything. Now I explained this before, let me explain it again, but using a cube. So I'm going to drop a cube in here. Now, if I select all the faces and I to inset, nothing happens because it's trying to inset an entire object. Now, insetting is a two-dimensional operation. You can't perform a two-dimensional operation on a three-dimensional object, but similar to the way that extruding an entire object just kind of, it does something different that you're probably not used to or expected. Insetting kind of does the same thing. If you want to toggle insetting individual faces, you have to hit I again, and then you can inset individual faces and you're good to go. So to illustrate what's happening, if I take these three faces, just those three, and I, and then hit I again, instead of insetting the entire object, it's only insetting a few faces as a group. That's really what you want to try to achieve. You can do the same thing on this side. You can inset groups of faces, but you cannot inset an entire object. Just does not work. Okay, two-dimensional operations, not a three-dimensional operation. It's the best way I know how to explain it at this level. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit I again. And if you don't notice anything happening, it may just be that your cursor is too far away from your control point. So move closer to the center just a little bit, maybe that much. And then I'm going to extrude individual faces. And then I'm going to show you something new. I'm going to come up here. You see the transform pivot point. I'm going to set this from median point to individual faces or individual origins. Scale it down. Now you can see it's a really nice spiky ball. And if I apply subdivision to it, 1, 2, 3, shade smooth. Probably just go with 2, but 3 makes it really smooth. And now we have a mollusk or a spike ball or whatever you want to turn into. You can turn it into a sea mine. I'm going to expand the whole thing, scale it up a bit, try to get it close to the size of our other objects, and I'll just go ahead and bring this over. So now we have that. I'm going to do one more. I just want to show you a slight difference with the extrude individual stuff. So another icosphere. I'm going to scale it up a bit. And then I'm going to inset faces, extrude individual faces. I'm going to keep it close. I'm going to inset again, extrude individual faces. Now you could do extrude along normals with this too. If you look at the wireframe, you can see it looks really cool. It's almost like something from a sci-fi movie. But if we go back to solid view, I can control 1, 2, 3, and you can see it looks really cool, shade smooth. We have a kind of coral mollusk looking creature, some kind of alien thing. It almost looks like that thing from Ego, the Living Planet from Guardians 2. Anyway, so I'll pull this over, just bring it up a little bit. So you get some really interesting organic type shapes. I'm going to do one more for you just to show you how cool this can be. So subdivision modeling is something I'm going to expand on greatly going forward, but I want to show you one more trick with extrusions. So I'm going to take this plane that I just created. I'm going to stretch it out on the X in edit mode. Just grab a couple of vertexes and stretch it over. And then I'm going to center it just a little bit. And then I'm going to create some loop cuts. About that many to start is good. Now what we're going to try to do is skinny up one side while leaving the other side about the size that it is. So I'm going to turn on the proportional editing. I'm going to turn it on to root. And, you know, I'm not sure it really matters which one you use. I'm just using root because I don't know. It's the one that I'm most familiar with. Anyway, so I'm going to add a loop cut here, and the idea is to square up each of these sections, right? So I'm going to GG and slide these edge loops. Now you can go into edge mode or you can do it in vertex mode. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to try to square them up. Now, if you end up in a position like this where you can't really do that, I'm going to go ahead and just dissolve this. I don't know why I added that. We'll go ahead and squared, squared, squared. We can add one here. Now those are squared. Squared. Yep, just keep going. There we go. And then this guy will dissolve. Maybe we add that back. And then maybe we just irregularly size this just a little bit. I'm going to turn, well, no, I'll leave it on. And then I'm going to scale this down just a bit. That's probably good right there, I think. So our overall scale looks good. Now I'm making a tentacle. So in case you weren't aware from the preview image, I'll go ahead and extrude this upward just a bit. And then what I'm going to do, oh, something to note here. You may have just noticed, whenever you extrude a plane and you have geometry on that plane already, if you extrude it, two things happen. One, you get this wall of intersecting faces all the way around. And then two, you have your faces that are opposing from the original normals facing downwards. So the original normals were all facing upward. When we extruded, we carried those normals up, but then created an inverted set of normals down. Now we remember the same thing happened with the cube. Whenever we extruded the entire cube, it left the geometry behind from the original cube, but then inverted its normals. So the same kind of thing happens here when you're extruding faces in the same object. So it starts to make sense a little bit. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off proportional editing, which is this toggle right here. And then I'm going to RY just a little bit, just to create some thickness. Go ahead and scale this up just a bit, RY, like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude individual faces. Okay, now I'm going to RY again, but you'll notice that something weird's happening, and this is happening because we still have individual origins turned on. I'm going to put this back on median point. RY. Bring this down just a bit. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to inset, but I have to be very, very careful. You notice I have some rectangular faces here. We'll see why it was important to square those off in just a second. But you'll notice right away that it becomes even more pronounced rectangular whenever we start messing with this. Let's go ahead and see if we can correct that. I'm going to Control Z a few times, bring it all the way back to being a plane. And I'm going to try to correct this just a bit. Add that there. Square them all off as best you can. This may take a few attempts. Sorry, that's my elevator kicking off there. And then we can see that it's starting to be a little less square over here. Now I just noticed that basically this is where all the stretch is. So I'm just going to grab the whole thing, GX, bring it over, squish it just a little bit. And we've got the same thing happening here, same thing happening here. Yeah, here and here. We'll just square them all up nice and square, or as close to square as we can get. Cool. So now, what happened here? What do you think happened right there? I don't know. SX0, and then we'll just bring these over on the X just a little bit. Okay, now I think we're good. Extrude again, RY, just to tilt it just a bit. Extrude individual faces. Again, RY. Okay, so now that I have the individual faces extruded, something to make note of, if you just did this and you had the auto merge normals turned on right here, or auto merge vertexes, sorry, this toggle will cause faces to be joined, and you don't really want that. You don't want vertexes to be joining right now. You want them to stay as separate as possible. So if this was on when you did this operation, Control Z, undo it, and then toggle it off, okay? So now I'm going to inset, and I have to be careful because I can overlap the inset and invert the faces. We don't want to do that. We just want to inset just enough to create the illusion of thickness, right? So I'm going to Oh, before I do anything else, now that I've just inset these, I have a bunch of vertexes selected. I'm going to come over to the object data properties, and you can see right here in the data panel, I'm going to go ahead and assign a vertex group. So I'm going to create one first, and with the vertexes selected, I'm going to click assign. And what that's going to do is going to make it to where I can quickly select all those vertexes again. Okay, but in this case, I'm going to switch to face mode, select those vertexes again. Now I have those faces selected, and now I can deselect these ones on the in. And then if I come back up here, I can go back to individual origins and scale these faces individually. And then I'm just going to deselect a few, scale, deselect a few, because it's supposed to have thicker walls, right? The bigger the tentacle is. So I'll just scale this down. Now all I'm doing is holding shift. If you hit C, it opens the circle select tool, and you can roll with your mouse wheel to increase the area of influence. And if you hold shift, you'll deselect instead of selecting. If you have C enabled, circle select, you'll just select everything. Hold shift to deselect stuff. Okay, and then I'm going to deselect one more. I'm going to scale it down even more to make it thicker, give it a little bit of an organic appearance, and that's it. So it doesn't look like much. The wireframe reveals a little bit more info. But now, if we go into solid view and control 1, 2, you can see that something is happening. So what I'm going to do is select all of those cores again to my tentacles, and I'm going to go ahead and extrude and bring it down. Now, something happened here. If you notice, some of these faces didn't quite shrink the way that I expected them to. This happens whenever you're doing a lot of geometry with variation. You can't scale everything the same. That's one of the reasons I was trying to deselect a few and then scale down and deselect a few. But sometimes that's not even enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the ones that look kind of normal and deselect them, since we don't need to scale them down anymore. Go back in a solid view. These look kind of normal, so we can deselect those as well. Go in the wireframe view, deselect those. These are starting to look not normal, so I'm going to go ahead and scale those down just a bit. Now, I have a problem. I don't have all the faces selected that I need to scale, so I'm going to Control plus, scale down. Okay, and I can probably Control minus and deselect these guys. Control plus, solid view, scale down. Okay, I'm going to Control minus, wireframe, deselect these guys, Control plus. And this is just it's a process. I know it's a little frustrating to have to go back and forth like this, but it works. Okay, so now I can Control minus, go back into wireframe, deselect these. I'm going to deselect that one too. Control plus, solid view, see what I'm doing, scale it down. And I'm going to leave it looking just like that, shade the whole thing smooth. Now, there are some jaggies right here, but remember there's a point where we subdivide it and it just starts to look normal. And you probably won't see that from the inside of the tentacle anyway. There would be more irregular shifting of the sucker cups on a real tentacle, or maybe they won't be. I don't know. I'm not a marine biologist, but I'm going to grab these bottom edges and I'm going to turn on proportional editing, and it's going to be a little tricky. I'm going to have to mess with my influence here just a little bit. Grab a few more over here just to create a little bit of depth. And it doesn't have to be perfect because remember, nothing in nature is except nature itself. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch into face mode and select just a few faces here. And I'm going to increase my sphere of influence and just rotate them just a little bit. Just a little bit, just to create a little bit of organic motion. Although I noticed that some of my faces didn't quite... You know what? Let me do vertexes instead and see if that looks a little bit better. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. And then we can always come down here and we can always shrink this. Make it look a little bit more organic, a little bit more normal. Although cephalopods have never looked normal to me, so I don't know. I digress. Here we go. I'm going to move this tentacle over into our project, and I'm going to center everything now. And that's it for this lesson. That pretty much covers all of the essentials for extrusions and how extrusions might behave under different circumstances. I covered extruding along normals, although briefly there is more I can cover with that. But extruding along normals is fairly self-explanatory. Again, if we just take, we can take a UV sphere and I'll scale it up, bring it down on the Y so you can see it. I can shade it smooth. And then if I select all the faces, Control F, and extrude along normals, doesn't look like anything happens, but the original sphere is on the inside, but with inverted normals. And we can see that really quickly if we look with edit mode enabled, and you can see the hairs there. I'm going to just make them bigger, but you can see the normals facing inward. If you were to Boolean this with another object, you could create like shell-like structures, maybe create geodes. I don't know. But it's really clever, a way that you can make things more interesting. Another thing you can do is, let's say you have a plane and you can bring it down. Now, I'm not going to leave any of this stuff in the project just because I'm quickly explaining something that I don't use a heck of a lot. If I increase the number of loop cuts I'm doing here, I'm just going to do a couple loop cuts here. Bring this up, the sphere of influence from the proportional. I'll just turn that off for now. We don't really need it. Now, if I take this and extrude the whole thing upward, right, you could see that it's basically doing the same thing as if I extruded along normals, except extruding along normals kind of follows its own rules, right? Extruding along normals is almost like you've seen the gel shots where you fire a shotgun shell or something into a gel body to see how the spread would work. This is kind of similar, where it's expanding outward from its origin instead of just extruding directly, right? So if we start right here, extrude along faces, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to try to expand those vectors outward. So that's useful for some types of geometry, or at least creative types of geometry. But I personally don't use it a heck of a lot. I'm going to come over here and just select a few faces. Maybe I deselect everything first. Select a few, those are edges, Control 3, faces, there we go. Select a few faces, and then I'm going to Control F, extrude along normals. And you can see it does kind of the same thing. So you might find a use for this type of extrusion. I don't use it a lot, like I said, myself. Although I can see how it'd be useful for creating things like mushrooms. Maybe you want to create a circle and bring it over. F, I to inset. I'll bring this up. So we've got a base extrude, right? And then if I decide I want to poke the faces, bring this up, and then select those faces, Control F, extrude along normals, GZ to bring it down. And then maybe I take the edge here and Control B. Yeah, I could see how that'd be fun. Start making little mushrooms. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe I just found a use for extrude along normals. Haven't really used it a lot myself, but you could see how extrusions of different types can have really powerful effects. In any case, you know what? I will leave that in. I wasn't planning on it, but I will leave that in the project. I'll put it over here since it's kind of simple. I'll put it on this end. And you can see the more complex stuff on the right and the more simple, fun stuff on the left. There you go. All right, that concludes this lesson. Let me know what you want to see in the next one. Until then, my plan is to continue on with different types of noise. I want to use noise patterns and show you how to displace and to distort geometries and how to use vertex groups to get finer control over what you're affecting. Okay, guys, that's it for this one. Take care.